In Dallas last week, where 12 officers were shot and 5 were killed at the end of what was a mostly peaceful protest. This tragedy leaves the country reeling and a lot of people asking a lot of questions.
Thursday became the deadliest day for law enforcement since 9/11. Dallas police confirmed the suspect was upset with recent police shootings and targeted white officers. To make sense of all of this, we have ASU professor Dr. Neil Lester of Project Humanities joining us to put some of this violence into perspective to us and also talk about the conversation we need to be having with our families and our friends. And it's opening up that conversation I think that people have a hard time with.
Yes. Well, talking about race is never something that's very easy.
Right.
Talking about violence is never easy, but it doesn't mean that we can put our heads in the sand to avoid it. This is not the first time that we've seen massacres. We've had Sandy Hook. We've had tragedies here in Tucson. So the idea is, how do we find those resources? And they are there so that we take the child where the child is, rather than looking at our comfort level in terms of talking about these really, really tough conversations.
How do you talk about, Tessa was asking you a moment ago, about what happened last week from Dallas to the other 2 states with the 2 men being killed by the officers?
Well, what ages are we talking about?
Well, how do you tell us?
Okay.
When do you begin?
Well, it begins when you think it's appropriate.
Okay.
You know your child better than anybody else.
Best,
no
sir.
specialist is going to be able to tell you when to talk to your child. But we can always talk about behavior that is not good behavior. We have bullying as early as kindergarten and elementary school. So let's talk about people doing bad things. People themselves aren't inherently bad. It's the behavior. So how do we take the child where the child is? And the child may be engaged in some of that bad behavior. So let's not assume that the child doesn't understand the difference between good behavior and bad behavior. Also keep in mind that many people in many of the communities most affected have been having these conversations. So it depends on which community you are in. For example, as an African American father, I've had to talk to my brown son about how he dresses and how he presents himself. So these are not necessarily conversations that other people have to have, and I think people are sort of recognizing now that everybody is affected by race. Not talking about it does not make it go away.
You know what's interesting is with my kids being 7, you know, we've talked about they don't understand a difference in race, right? Everybody is the same to them. We have different colored skin. We look a little different. So it's how do you make it to not, you don't want to show them the hatred in the world, but you want to be able to explain why this is happening.
Right. Well, part of that is looking at history, and sometimes history is unpleasant. But we also have differences, though. Even within families, we have differences. So we can talk about how do you resolve differences so that violence and bullying and beating up people isn't the answer. So there is a kind of sense that we all need to resolve conflict. This is a conflict. It's a conflict around one thing. I will say this, though. Trying to imagine that we are not raced does not erase race. We all have a race. So let's not pretend that we're all the same. Now, we certainly may be all the same in terms of our values, but certainly we all look different. Identical twins are different. So difference in and of itself, and acknowledging that, is not a bad thing. So we can talk about race. There are resources, there are videos, there are books out there.
And that's why you do what you do and created the Humanities 101 program.
Absolutely, where we can talk about compassion and empathy and integrity and respect and self-reflection. Those are the kinds of things that everybody can do. And as President Obama said on the occasion of the Tucson tragedy, we may not be able to stop all the evil in the world, but how we treat each other is entirely up to us.
It seems like the most often asked question on social media from people is just, what is going on with our world? And you know, we know what it was like back in the 50s and 60s and our history. And before. And how bad it was. Is it getting worse? Are we not getting better?
Well, you know, I don't know if we've evolved so much as the technologies have evolved in such a way that we have access to more information more quickly and more broadly. So, you know, I don't know if we've ever had a moment in our American or world history where violence hasn't been something that defined us. So to imagine that somehow we've become more violent doesn't necessarily represent the history of the world or the history of our human existence.
It's just there in front of our faces
we see
now. Social media coverage.
I wish we could have hours to talk to you. That's what we need. But
well, I teach classes, and you're welcome to sit in some of those classes. Okay. And we do have 3-hour classes.
Are we going to get
graded? Does he have to do a report? Does he have to do a report?
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
We'll talk about that.
Thank you so much.
You're very
really
welcome.
a pleasure.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr. Lester.
Thank
so
you.
informative.
Thank you.